English for Beginners. Book 1, Part 5. Thank you for watching the previous videos. I hope you enjoyed them. May I help you?
Yes, thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Lesson 5. That is. A learning point. 1. We use that is to point to a thing farther from speaker. 2. That is followed by singular noun. Examples. That is a cat. That is an owl. Three that is means itu adalah. B. Reading. Read these sentences. 1. That is a dog. 2. That is an eel. 3. That is a tiger. 4. That is a snake. 5. That is a lion. 6. That is an ant. 7. That is an ox. 8. That is a monkey. 9. That is a horse. 10. That is a bear. See exercises. 1. Write the words in correct order. 1. A is that buffalo. That is a buffalo. 2. Goat, that is a. That is a goat. 3. Is crocodile a that? That is a crocodile. 4. That N is elephant. That is an elephant. 5. A tet frog is. That is a frog. 6. Giraffe is tet a. That is a giraffe. 7. Zebra a is that. That is a zebra. 8. That donkey a is. That is a donkey. 9. Is tet mosquito a. That is a mosquito. 10. A fly is that. That is a fly. To make the sentences based on the picture using that is. 1. That is an elephant. 2. That is a lizard. 3. That is a spider. 4. That is a hippopotamus. 5. That is a crocodile. 6. That is a deer. 7. That is a bird. 8. That is a mouse. 9. That is a butterfly. 10. That is a duck. 3. Translate into Indonesian. 1. That is an eagle.
Itu adalah seekor burung elang.
2. That is a cow.
Itu adalah seekor sapi.
3. That is a fish.
Itu adalah seekor ikan.
4. That is a hen.
Itu adalah seekor ayam betina.
5. That is a grasshopper.
Itu adalah seekor belalang.
6. That is a marble.
Itu adalah sebuah kelereng.
7. That is a desk.
Itu adalah sebuah meja belajar.
8. That is a chair.
Itu adalah sebuah kursi.
9. That is a door.
Itu adalah sebuah pintu.
10. That is a pencil.
Itu adalah sebuah pensil.
4. Translate into English.
1. Itu adalah seekor unta.
That is a camel.
2. Itu adalah seekor ayam jantan.
That is a cock.
3. Itu adalah seekor orangutan.
That is an orangutan.
4. Itu adalah seekor burung gagak.
That is a crow.
5. Itu adalah seekor burung betet.
That is a parrot.
6. Itu adalah sebuah payung.
That is an umbrella.
7. Itu adalah sebuah penghapus.
That is an eraser.
8. Itu adalah sebuah buku.
That is a book.
9. Itu adalah sebuah penggaris.
That is a ruler.
10. Itu adalah sebuah jeruk.
That is an orange. Dememorization. Read and memorize. 1. That is a cat. That is an owl. 2. U, V, W, X, Y, Z. 3. 21, 30, 31, 40, 41, 50. 4. Buffalo, frog, hippopotamus, butterfly, giraffe, mosquito, crocodile, goat, donkey, grasshopper.
That is not an eagle.
Yes, that is an owl. Is this SMPN 1 boy a lolly?
Yes, this is SMPN 1 Boyolali. May I help you?
Lesson 6. That is not. A learning point. 1. To make the negative sentence of that is, we put not after the verb is. Examples. 1. Affirmative. That is a cat. Negative. That is not a cat. 2. Affirmative. That is an owl. Negative. That is not an owl. 2. That is not means.
Itu adalah bukan.
B. Reading. Read these sentences. 1. That is not a tiger. 2. That is not an elephant. 3. That is not an eel. 4. That is not a lion. 5. That is not a gorilla. 6. That is not a snake. 7. That is not a bear. 8. That is not an eagle. 9. That is not a parrot. 10. That is not a buffalo. See exercises. 1. Write the words in correct order. 1. Is Tet a horse? Not. That is not a horse. 2. An east antelope. Not that. That is not an antelope. 3. Cow, not. Tet is a. That is not a cow. 4. That beard, not a, is. That is not a bird. 5. Lizard, not east a, that. That is not a lizard. 6. An east that, not ox. That is not an ox. 7. Not e is monkey, that. That is not a monkey. 8. Is dog, tet, not a. That is not a dog. 9. Fish a is tet, not. That is not a fish. 10. That's not in is animal. That is not an animal. To make the sentences based on the picture using that is not. 1. Zebra. That is not a zebra. 2. Owl. That is not an owl. 3. Donkey. That is not a donkey. 4. Duck. That is not a duck. 5. Crocodile. That is not a crocodile. 6. Hen. That is not a hen. 7. Tiger. That is not a tiger. 8. Fly. That is not a fly. 9. Wolf. That is not a wolf. 10. Butterfly. That is not a butterfly. 3. Rewrite in negative sentence. 1. That is a pig. That is not a pig. 2. That is a rhinoceros. That is not a rhinoceros. 3. That is a worm. That is not a worm. 4. That is a caterpillar. That is not a caterpillar. 5. That is a crow. That is not a crow. 6. That is a bull. That is not a bull. 7. That is a pigeon. That is not a pigeon. 8. That is a dove. That is not a dove. 9. That is a goose. That is not a goose. 10. That is a cockroach. That is not a cockroach. For translate into Indonesian. 1. That is not a mosquito. Itu adalah bukan seekor nyamuk. 2. That is not a goat. Itu adalah bukan seekor kambing. 3. That is not an antelope.
Itu adalah bukan seekor antelope.
4. That is not a giraffe. Itu adalah bukan seekor jerapah. 5. That is not a deer. Itu adalah bukan seekor rusa. 6. That is not a crow. Itu adalah bukan seekor burung gagak. 7. That is not an ant. Itu adalah bukan seekor semut. 8. That is not an owl. Itu adalah bukan seekor burung hantu. 9. That is not an eagle. Itu adalah bukan seekor burung elang. 10. That is not a lion. Itu adalah bukan seekor singa. 5. Translate into English. 1. Itu adalah bukan seekor unta. That is not a camel. 2. Itu adalah bukan seekor tikus. That is not a mouse. 3. Itu adalah bukan seekor belalang. That is not a grasshopper. 4. Itu adalah bukan seekor kuda Nil. That is not a hippopotamus. 5. Itu adalah bukan seekor ayam jantan. That is not a cock. 6. Itu adalah bukan seekor semut. That is not an ant. 7. Itu adalah bukan seekor angsa. That is not a goose. 8. Itu adalah bukan seekor ular. That is not a snake. 9. Itu adalah bukan seekor cicak. That is not a lizard. 10. Itu adalah bukan seekor monyet. That is not a monkey. Dememorization. Read and memorize. 1. That is a cat. That is an owl. That is not a cat. That is not an owl. 2. 51. 60. 70. 80. 90. 100. 3. Bill. Crow. Pigeon. Wolf. Caterpillar. Dove. Pig. Worm. Cockroach. Goose. Rhinoceros. Thank you and see you on next lesson.